Hello everyone, I'm Chloe Johnson and welcome to this Fresh Business Thinking webinar series, Lockdown Learning for Businesses, supported by BT. BT Skills for Tomorrow aims to empower businesses and their employees with the digital skills to help grow their business. The Skills for Tomorrow website includes free learning content that small businesses and their employees can access at any time on topics such as connecting with customers on a mobile, making sure your customers can find you online, and much more. To find out more, you can click the link in the comments. Coronavirus is continuing to be a challenge for small businesses and entrepreneurs across the UK. The outbreak leaves an overwhelming uncertainty into the future for business owners, but this is a time when as a business community, we need to come together and support one another. And we're lucky enough to work with organisations and individuals who are passionate about supporting entrepreneurs during this difficult time. One of those is our speaker today, John Courtney, founder and chief executive of boardroomadvisors.co.uk. John is a serial entrepreneur, having founded 7 different businesses in Bristol over a 40-year period. He has trained and worked as a strategy consultant, raised funding through angels, VCs, and crowdfunding, and exited businesses. Today, John will give you an insight into growing your business post-lockdown, how to analyse options in the new normal and create an actionable plan, and how mentors, board advisory, and non-executive directors can help in different ways. John will be talking for around 40 minutes and then we'll have some time for a Q&A. If you do have any questions, you can leave them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to them later on in the session. That's all from me for now, and I'll pass over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Chloe, and good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Let me share my screen with you in a second. John Courtney, Boardroom Advisors. We're a national organisation providing part-time executive directors to funded startups, scale-ups, and SMEs. And I was lucky enough to train as a strategy consultant, so I want to share some of the things that I learnt during that process and during 40 odd years of founding, running, and scaling 7 different businesses. So no more ado, let me share my screen with you, and we'll get to some of the slides. The slides will be available, and Chloe will tell you how that is the case going forward. So we're going to be talking about growth strategy to maximise opportunities after lockdown, and I gather the Chancellor has this morning extended some of the packages that he put forward for furloughing and covering 80% of businesses. Obviously, as we come out of lockdown, we need to perhaps be doing some different things. And while we are still mainly in lockdown, it's a good opportunity to have a look at some of the things that we can do to revise some of our strategy for the current situation, and more importantly, as we come out of it and business starts to happen just a little bit more. Let me just do this. Just put the slideshow on properly so we can have a look at that. Hopefully everybody can see that properly. So if we just look through, we can have a look at strategy and strategic direction, first of all, generally, and then we're going to look at some specific things. So when we're talking to companies, we obviously talk to them about their strategic direction. Do they discuss strategy, and who discusses it, and how the company analyzes strategic direction, and do they do it themselves through their board? Do they have external advice, or a non-exec director, or a consultant, or that sort of thing? Obviously, it is a lot easier to analyze strategy with at least an external facilitator. Sometimes we all can't see the wood for the trees. So those are some of the common questions, and the reason why we look at strategy, because it gives company clear purpose and objectives, and obviously in the current climate that's even more important. And we're going to be looking at 3 different things. SWOT, which most of us will know very well, so we're not going to be spending very long on that at all, but we'll cover that very quickly. Some crisis assessment, obviously very relevant for the current business, and a particular tool that I learned as a strategy consultant, most analysis. A lot of the business tools out there are very good, very useful, but most of them have what I consider a fatal flaw, that they do get a lot of issues out on the table, get them talked about, but not many of the management tools out there actually do something. So take the business forward, take strategic analysis and put it into an action plan which you can monitor and assess and change. And that's really where the most analysis comes in. And I've found that very useful with many different types of businesses. But all strategy and all management tools like this really help companies get from where they are now to where they want to be. And so it's very important to have a clear idea of of both things, where you are now and where you want to be. And you know, it's the single most important thing. If you don't have a strategic direction in your company, and if you haven't reassessed that during the current climate, then you're really just storing up trouble for tomorrow. So I just want to talk briefly about the SWOT analysis. SWOT's been around for ages. Most people know it. And I do think it's a useful tool. I've put it up there not to rubbish it, but to praise it. I think it's very useful for getting issues out on the table. Often, you know, boardroom advisors, we do this with clients, in old money, we would have people around a board table with a flip chart, and really it's a matter of brainstorming these things. So just to give you an idea, so obviously strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats make up SWOT. Very important to remember that strengths and weaknesses are internal things and opportunities and threats are external. So that's external to the opportunity. So a strength might be good financial control, because that's an internal issue, whereas an opportunity might be, coronavirus might be an opportunity, and we can come to that later, but that's something that's external to the organization. Also, I think it's important to make sure that these things, all of them, are particularly strengths and opportunities, are helpful to achieving our objectives, and weaknesses and threats are harmful. It's obvious, isn't it? So what we often do is to hold a brainstorming session often with the directors of a company, and we're facilitating, and it's a matter of just going around the room and shouting out with any brainstorming session, as I'm sure most of you know. It's a matter of shouting out what comes to top of mind, not discussing, not analysing, certainly not being critical of anything that anybody says. It's a matter of getting the ideas, getting them up on the board as quickly as possible, just getting a list up there. And eventually when you start to run dry as a group, you know, the list may be 5, it may be 15, it may be more. Then you can start to assess and analyse some of those ideas, perhaps dismiss some that are not applicable, perhaps look at some of the smaller ideas, perhaps joining 1 or 2 of them together to make perhaps a bigger one, and also getting a sense of scale. So which are the most important strengths, and the worst weaknesses, and the greatest opportunities, and the really terrible threats. So get some idea of the most important ones, because it's very difficult in any organisation to tackle everything. So it's most important to tackle the big issues. It's blindingly obvious, but just need saying. Oh, I skipped over a slide, but that's fine. That's actually where I want to go. So let's go back to that. So as I say, SWOT analysis, great for getting some of the issues out on the table. Doesn't do anything with it, but we'll come to that because some of these other tools will start to use that information. So we're going to park SWOT, or if you've at some stage in your group done a list of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, do it, park it, because we'll be coming back and using it a bit later. One of the other management tools that I wanted to talk about, which is something we've developed over a while. It's a kind of, we've magpied from other tools really, but a crisis assessment strategy, very pertinent with coronavirus, but can be used in any other type of crisis. 2008 financial crisis. God help us, World War III, whatever the situation is. And it can also be used in perhaps in a crisis, perhaps not a global crisis, it might be a countrywide crisis, it might even just be an industry-wide crisis. So just some trigger questions really to go through, and we would go through this in a group, and really just as a group answer the questions one by one. So the most important thing is defining what the crisis is in one sentence. Now, in coronavirus land, that's pretty easy. But in other circumstances, perhaps it's a crisis in a particular industry. It just helps to define exactly what that crisis is, because people around the table may have slightly different understandings of the crisis. So defining it is might only take a minute, but it's important, I think, to do. And then to think, once that's defined, well, what's likely to change in the world? Now, for coronavirus, obviously, lots of things are likely, many things have already changed in the world. And for us today, this is perhaps more about what's likely to change on a longer term basis. That's hoping that that this particular crisis only lasts for months, perhaps only a few more weeks if we're really lucky. But on an ongoing basis, what's likely to change in the world? There's some obvious things from the top of the head. It's possible, not certain, but it's possible that more people might work from home. It's possible that more people might use Zoom and other type of communication tools. So those are some obvious things. What other things might happen, might change on an ongoing basis in the world generally? And I don't mean for your business, for your industry at this stage. It's just kind of breaking this down into bite-sized chunks. So what's the big picture? What's likely to change in the world, and then perhaps in the business world as well. And then you can move down on level again in terms of what's likely to change in your particular industry. Some industries are going to change drastically. Pubs, restaurants, hospitality. So, for example, in those industries, seating arrangements. So it might be that outdoor seating becomes extremely important. Certainly in the short term, that's likely to happen. In the long term, don't know, but it's a possibility. So these sorts of issues, what's likely to change in your particular industry? And to some of these questions, the answer may be none. but that it's just a checklist to go through and to talk about and to try and get some sort of perspective. And then digging deeper into your business, how will these changes, referencing the changes that we've just talked about in your industry, in the business world, and in the world generally, but how will these things affect your revenue streams? Will they affect them? And how will this change? Will it change your value proposition? So it's worth going back to your value proposition. If we have time, I've got a slide on value proposition a bit later. If not, I can forward it on to people who are interested. But having a look at your value proposition, again, getting it up on the screen, talking it around as a group. Is this still relevant? Is this still valid in the current situation? Do we have to tweak it? Is part of, if you're in hospitality, if you're a pub, for example, and if you have a massive beer garden, then perhaps part of, that might be part of your value proposition. Certainly it might be a major part in the early days, but it may be more important. So just have a look at your value proposition, revisit it. What does it change, if anything? And have a look at some of the other marketing pieces. So what about your customer segments? Are your customer segments going to be the same? Are you still serving the same segment of the business community or of the consumer world? Are those segments going to shift a little bit? So, for example, restaurants, they were often majoring in dine-in, eat-in, and short-term, a lot of those have gone to takeaway or take-out, as the Americans say. So those sorts of changes happen, perhaps in your value proposition, perhaps in your customer segments. You might serve different segments with eat-in and take-away. And what about the relationships with your customers? How is the current coronavirus crisis going to change that, if anything? Certainly, we're perhaps at the moment more at arm's length with our clients and our customers. Also creates lots of opportunities. Here I am. I'm talking on webinar to I'm not quite sure how many people. 83 it says on the screen. And I'm doing this from my home office. Before I had to travel around the country to reach this sort of an audience. So have a think about your prospects as well as your customers and clients. And how might it alter your distribution channels and your partners? Again, it's just a time to reflect, to look back at your marketing plan, if you have one. What are your distribution channels? Are you going direct all the time? Are you going through partners? And are those partners likely to still be there? Are they going to change? Are you going to change the types of partners that you have? And your channels, are you likely to go more online than you have in the past? So, for example, supermarkets. We've seen massive queues physically outside the supermarket, but also a massive queue for online shopping. And it's likely, possible, that online shopping will become a much more major part of the supermarket's delivery. So that may help, that may change their distribution. And what about resources? Given possible changes, distribution, and so on and so forth, the earlier points we talked about, what about your resources? Are they going to have to change? Are you going to have to do something different? Are you going to have to resource and so on? So again, with the supermarkets, they're going to have more delivery drivers, perhaps more people on the website, maintenance. Those sorts of structural changes. And how is your cost structure going to be affected? What does that mean? So for a supermarket, does it mean that you have more people? Probably. Does that mean you have less in store? Well, quite possibly. Unless the whole supermarket sector is growing, unlikely. So it's just a matter of looking at your cost structure, how it's going to be affected by some of the changes. So these are all just common sense questions, really. But once you've got a checklist of questions to go through, you can then analyze and decide what, if anything, needs tweaking. And now, perhaps when sales are lower than they might otherwise have been, perhaps there's a little more time to look at some of these questions and just make sure as you come out of lockdown that you can analyze some of these questions and make the necessary adjustment. So I just wanted to turn to another tool I mentioned earlier called Most Analysis. It sounds very similar to Swot. Swot is very simple, useful, but very simple. Most Analysis looks at first glance to be very simple, but actually it's kind of a bit like an onion. And as you peel away the layers, it gets a little bit more complicated. Best not to overthink it, really. Best to treat it as a relatively simple tool. And what it's going to help us to do is to take the issues that came up in the SWOT analysis, and it's going to take some of the issues that we've just talked about in the crisis assessment, and then actually to try and do something with them, to make changes in our processes, make changes in our structure and our organization and the things that we do, and critically right the way down to people's to-do lists. That's one of the problems about strategy. Sometimes, it's great, I've had a good workshop session and we've produced this strategic plan on a bit of paper, and that's great, and we're all enthusiastic, and then sometimes the bit of paper goes into the drawer and then isn't looked at again for 12 months. And that isn't really what we need to be doing with strategy. It needs to be a living, breathing document, because things change not just once a year, they change continually all the time. And you have to continually assess to make sure that you're on the right track, and to adjust strategy according to the reality. But neither of those tools we just talked about, and certainly, none of the rest of the tools that I'm conscious of do much in terms of implementation. So Most Analysis kind of does that. So let's just go through it from bottom left. So M stands for mission. So it's organization's purpose. By this I mean the business purpose. I don't mean anything wider than that. I certainly don't mean a vision. I really mean it's helpful, I think, to think about hard things here. So by that I mean turnover and profit. Keep it simple. Don't think about areas of distribution or numbers of staff or your product range or something. Just keep it at really high level. Strategy is about where are you now, where do you want to go to, and this is about where do you want to go to. And this often takes the biggest time with a group of people, is actually getting everybody bought in to exactly where you want the company to go in terms of sales and profit over a period of time. So first of all, choose a timescale. 1 year is always good. You can have two timescales, a 1 year and a 3 year. Larger companies perhaps might do a 5 year thing. Smaller companies, 5 years just so far away. It's perhaps not that useful. So either 1 or 1 and 3, I would suggest. So where are you now? So first of all, get a clear idea of what is the current turnover and what is the current profit of the business. And I had a session with a company recently that actually couldn't quite nail that down. They could go back to what was filed at Companies House. That's true. But that was months and months ago, and actually their current situation they didn't have too much of a handle on, and it turned out to be one of the weaknesses in the SWOT analysis. Anyway, you have to make the best stab you can at what is the current position on sales and profit. So you know where you're starting from, and then you can say, well, where do we want to be in a year's time, sales and profit, and where do we want to be if you're doing a second timeline, say in 3 years' time. Now, what often happens is round the table, everybody kind of wants to go at a different pace. Typically, you know, the board around the table, or the partners, or whatever it is, you know, they're different ages. They want to do different things over a different time scale. Perhaps one wants to exit in a year, one wants to exit in 10 years. One wants to grow very fast and one wants to be more slow and steady. So getting consensus about the mission, the business mission, the sales and the profit that you want to do in 1 and 3 year time is more difficult than it sounds like. Very simple, doesn't it? But it's more a matter of compromise and discussion and negotiation. And if we, you know, sometimes I do a whole day session with a company on most analysis, and half of the day might be spent on the mission, getting people to agree where it is that they want to go over what period of time. And you can't really move on until you've got that, because otherwise everything else is built on sand. One person wants to go slow and steady and one wants to grow super fast. You can see there's kind of an inbuilt conflict in there, but really useful as a group to agree that, because suddenly everybody's on the same page, and very commonly that hasn't been the case before a session like that is done. So hopefully at the end of that session, you've agreed where it is that you want to get to in a period of time. The tricky bit is obviously getting there. Now, needless to say, the speed at which you want to grow, if growth is in fact in the mission, but the speed determines the number of things that you need to do. So if, for example, you want to grow by 10% over 3 years, you don't have to do many things in order to do that. You kind of just more, you know, have to secure the land that you've got rather than march forward in military type terms. If, however, you want to double in a year, crikey, you have to do an awful lot. So the where you're going, the mission drives a lot of the strategy going forward. So the next section on this is objectives. That's the O in most, obviously. So what are the key things that are going to help the company achieve the mission? The key planks, it doesn't really matter what the words are. People don't get worried about the language. You know, people mix up objectives and goals and strategies and tactics, and it all gets a little confusing at some stage. Management jargon, really. It's what are the key things that are going to help you get to your mission? That's in English what it means. Now, very difficult to think about such things and to come up with ideas like that in isolation. Much easier to go back to the 2 tools that we've just looked at. So have a look at the SWOT analysis, have a look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Have a discussion around what are the key things. You can't work, you know, as you go through most analysis, you're going to come out with action plans, you're going to come out with things that go on people's task lists. You can't work on too many things at once, or you just get blinded and you know, you end up rabbit in the headlights. So what are the big issues? Are there any strengths? So relatively simple. Are there any absolutely core critical strengths that you need to hang on to, or actually the whole business model, the whole value proposition starts to fall apart? If there aren't, then don't even use any strengths. But if there is one, then perhaps put that in place. Weaknesses is a ripe area for work, because weaknesses are the things that are going to hold you back, and unless you solve the big ones, then you're unlikely to be able to move forward and perhaps grow by 50% over 3 years or 20%, whatever it is. So what are the key weaknesses? It may be perhaps a lack of perceived financial strength. just to pluck something out of the air. If that's absolutely critical, because without that you can't grow to the stage that you want, then that's perhaps something that we should convert into being an objective. I'll tell you how we do that in a second. Looking at the opportunities again are really ripe for converting into objectives. And you know, top of everybody's list at the moment will be coronavirus. It does create opportunities for a lot of people. It does create threats for some, and things can be both an opportunity and a threat. They can be both a strength and a weakness. Don't be afraid of having things in two boxes. But what are the key opportunities that, if you take advantage of them, that will really help you get to your mission? So it's just working through those, working through also the crisis assessment that we looked at. Is anything coming out very strongly through that crisis assessment that, my God, unless we get this in place, you know, that, you know, we're really not going to be able to get to our turnover and profit. So taking those big issues, how do you then convert them into an objective? Well, again, we mustn't spend too much time with management speak, but I always say, just try and put which will at the end, the phrase which will. So if you've got, I just plucked out of the air, didn't I, an example of perceived lack of financial strength. There you go. So how do we convert that into an objective? So we just turn the sentence around a bit. So to increase our perceived financial strength, it may not be real, but it may just be the perception. So to increase our perceived financial strength, which will, what will it do? Well, again, I'm making this up, but you'll have your own answer, but it may allow us to take to be partnered more frequently by enterprise companies. Oh, sorry, I've just banged my keyboard with my hands. Let's just go back here. So there must be a reason that it's a key thing. What will it do? What will it change? And the phrase "which will" just kind of helps you. And if you can't think of which will do what, then is it really a key thing that needs to be an objective? So you've tackled the key things. You've got a list. I suggest not too long, half a dozen, say, roughly. That's not an exact number, but too few, it's a bit thin. Too many, you're trying to tackle too much. Keep it to the big issues. Because for each of these objectives, for each one of these, we want to design some strategies or some options in order to tackle the objectives. So, and that's what strategies are. Strategies are just options. And if you get, you know, at some stage going through this process, there's always a blur moment where what's a strategy, what's a tactic, what's an objective, what's the goal, oh God, you know, just go back to simple stuff. Strategies are options. So what are the options? So if you want to change your perceived financial strength, what are the options? What can we do? And again, it's a brainstorming, you know, thing. People say, well, you know, strategic planning is very boring. No, strategy is great fun. It's exciting. You know, it's lots of brainstorming. It's coming up with ideas. It's poking ideas. It's testing ideas. It's seeing what will work, seeing what won't work. Maybe I'm just a sad ex-strategy consultant. Anyway, so go around the room. So we want to change our perceived financial strength. What can we do? What are our options, guys? And you go around the room. Come on, what have we got? Okay, we could get a financial controller in, or a financial director. We could get an accountant. We could get a non-exec director. We could get some funding in and show. There's lots of, I don't know what the answers are for these. There are lots of options, aren't there? And that's all that we're doing at this stage. We're brainstorming. We're not criticizing. We're not analyzing. We're getting it up on the board. And then only afterwards, when we're starting to run dry, do we start to pick them apart. Because we can't, if there are 10 options up there, we can't work on 10 options. We can't. It's just impossible. Too many. So we have to whittle it down, but only once we're kind of running dry of ideas. Perhaps the smaller ones again, join the smaller ones together, so you perhaps get a bigger one, and then rank them. If it's not obvious what the big one is, or the big two, you might have a couple of options, a couple of strategies that you might want to run, but I suggest no more than two, otherwise you're probably trying to bite off more than you can chew. But what are the ones most likely to be successful? If it's not obvious, go around the room, rate them. You've got 10 options, rate them 1 to 10. Or knock out the small ones, you only got 3 left. Right, rate them 1, 2, 3, go around the room, and you find a consensus. And with a consensus, then with a strategy or strategies, so in the example we have, you might want to get a financial director on board, and you might want to get some investment. You might run with 2 strategies in order to achieve that particular objective. And that's fine, just 1 or 2, I suggest no more than that. And that's what you're going to run with. Well, that's great. But that's still not actually getting people to do things. So one of the keys of the most analysis is then taking those strategies, those options, and putting them on people's to-do lists. So that's the T in tactics. How are the strategies going to be put into action? And tactics need an owner who's going to do it, and it needs a timescale. So it's who's going to do what by when. So if you're going to, in that example, perhaps take on a finance director, then who's got the armband? Okay, you, Mr. Chairman, you're going to take the armband, and you're going to do it by end of first quarter. So what are you going to do? Well, actually, there's several things that the chairman might have to do. He might have to research the marketplace. He might have to speak to recruitment companies. He might have to hopefully speak to companies like ours. He looks at the various options. He'll then have to interview people, and then perhaps a panel will make the final decision. So there might be 2 or 3 tactics, 2 or 3 actions, 2 or 3 things that go on his to-do list or task list that might spill out of that. But if you've got actions and you've got owners and you've got timescale, then everything at the tactical level joins up with the strategies. They make the strategies work. And there's the acid test. Is this a good tactic? Well, does it move the option on? Does it actually do something with that option? Does it make it happen? It doesn't? Well, perhaps that's not really a tactic. If it does, if it moves it on, great. And is it going to go on somebody's task list? Yes, great. And if those strategies work, then is that going to help achieve the objective? Yes. Well, in that case, we've got a good strategy or strategies. And if we meet those objectives, are we likely to get towards our mission? So there's an acid test at each stage to make sure that you're on track and to make sure that everything is hanging together as a unit. And one of the great things, I think the 2 great things about the most analysis, one is that things go on people's task lists. And the other is that when strategies don't work, and some of them don't work, this isn't foolproof, it's going to work every time. It's a process, it's a structure. So when strategies don't work as well as you'd like to see them, it gives you a point to go back to without dumping it all together. So let's say getting a finance director doesn't work as well as you like. You either can't find the right person, or you get a person in and it doesn't solve the issue, and whatever, that perhaps was a faulty strategy. Then rather than dumping the whole thing and saying, well, we've just got to live with the fact that we have a perceived financial weakness, it gives you a step back to go to, well, what were the other strategies we looked at? What were the other options we considered, as well as getting a finance director in? Well, we talked about fundraising. Okay, and what were the other ones? And you go back to that and you look at the 3 or 4 strategies that you discussed at that time, reassess them and say, well, actually, yeah, perhaps fundraising is a better way in hindsight of doing this. Shall we go ahead with that strategy, guys? And you're not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that's the problem. Without a structure, without a strategic process, you go from A to Z very quickly, and then Z doesn't work, and you throw it away and just have to start from scratch. This gives you somewhere to go, and because of the tactics, it gives you tasks and things on people's to-do lists, really. I hope that makes some sort of sense. I'm conscious of time. So where are we? This is the same subject again. This is just expressed in a different format, top to bottom rather than round in a little semicircle. But it just gives you a checklist here. So the mission now at the top. So where is it you want to go and in what timescale? So that's the checklist. For objectives, so go back to the SWOT and also go back to your crisis assessment if you use that. Strategies are just options, and with tactics, they're tasks and timescales, and owners as well. Okay, so that's really just a run through of 3 tools to have a look and to reassess your business strategy. Particularly in the current crisis time, but in any crisis time. Use the time as best you can, use it sparingly, use it cleverly at the moment. So when you come out of lockdown, you've a chance, your ship was going in one direction, you've reassessed, it's now going in a slightly different direction possibly, and you'd be better meeting the opportunities as they come up. So we're going to go to some questions in a second, because I'm conscious we've just gone 40 minutes. And I've been rattling on. I haven't been able to have a look at the questions as they've come in. We've got some coming in on Q&A and some on comments, I think. So Chloe, I don't know if you're there. If you have a chance of asking me some of these questions, I'll try and tackle them.
Thank you very much, John. That was filled with some great advice for our audience. Let's have a look at some of the questions. We've had one from Anita. There is a lot of talk about the need to be flexible, pivoting and taking advantage of short-term opportunities. This seems to be the opposite of strategic planning and direction. How can we reconcile the 2 approaches?
Yeah, well, I disagree. I think opportunism is there's nothing wrong with it, and you can add it in the planning process. So that's really what we've done here. If you look at the crisis assessment, that's saying, well, actually, what can we take advantage of? What can we do differently? What do we have to change? What do we want to change as a result of changing circumstances? So yeah, that particular structure, I think that kind of does it really. There's nothing wrong with you've got to remain flexible, particularly smaller businesses. You've got to be flexible in the marketplace and adapt to circumstances. And listen, what we've seen recently, the flexibility we've seen. How many emails have we all got from people who have designed face masks, for example? how many companies have changed their production processes to come out with PPE. Just fabulous, the innovation and the flexibility. So we've got to be able to do that, but you can do that within the structure, and using those questions I put is a way of doing that.
The next question has come through anonymous. When most SMEs have lost revenue and cash flow, how can an external consultant help out when they've fired people and don't have capital?
Well, yes, it's difficult, isn't it? You've got to, if you have an external consultant, then you have to find a way of paying them. Otherwise, they're less likely to be committed to the process, so won't want to enter the process at all. Marrying the whole, if you let staff go, but then you get an external consultant, do you feel bad about it? Well, I think you just have to go back to common sense, and if you genuinely think that getting an external consultant is going to help the business get on a surer footing and go forward with more confidence, and in turn to be able to re-employ people, then that's quite possibly a good decision. Perhaps that's it's more of a feeling. Is it likely to produce the results? If it is, then yeah, it's certainly something I would consider.
Okay, the next one is from Valerie. I am in the infant stage of creating my full service event management business, and I'm currently going through a large database of potential clients to identify and target my market. Any suggestions as to how to approach the task?
Yes, I've got another webinar which is about adjusting your marketing and your growth plans according to the strategy, whereas this one is looking at the business strategy, business as a whole. That's looking at growth and marketing in particular. So too big a question to answer right now, I'm afraid. But yes, there are processes. The principle again goes back to look at your marketing plan, look at the pieces of it, such as the value proposition, such as what's unique about your company. Look at your marketing channels, and all of these various subsections of marketing and growth, and assess what you're doing, and get a plan going forward. But that's we have a date, Chloe, I think, for another. I don't have it to hand, but that's covered on my next webinar, I think.
Okay, the next one is from Stephen. What percentage of companies' time should be spent planning?
Well, it's one of those, how long's a piece of string? You don't want to sit there and contemplate your neighbour all the time, and you also don't want to do it too infrequently. So there isn't really a number you can put on it. It's more a case of my suggestion, my recommendation is do a thorough plan, at least annually, and assess it. And now's a good opportunity. Assess it on a regular basis. For big companies that might be monthly, or for smaller companies perhaps that's quarterly. So if you've got a plan written down, so a most analysis is what we would do with clients. Get the most analysis out. Get your advisor back if you can. Do it yourself if you can't. But look at the plan. Discuss the plan. Are we still in the same place? How is that strategy? Is it working? Is it not working? Do we need to tweak it a little bit? Is it working really bad? Do we need to dump it and start again? Assess it regularly. That would be my suggestion.
We've had one from AC, who is a personal development and health coach. Said, if the customer cannot know what is going to change in the future, how can we facilitate further?
Well, I think it's always best guesses. People say that to me. So how can I do a forward budget? I don't know, I'm just guessing. Well, yeah. So what you do with a forward budget is you use best guess. You look at history, and you look at the factors that got to where you were in the past, and you make an educated guess going forward. And that's all we can do if you're doing strategy forward within a structure. Choose any of these that I've shared with you today, or others. Make an educated guess. It's your and try not to do it alone. Try and do it with others, because then you get a more rounded view. But it often is a best guess. It's an estimate. Is it more or less likely that a garden will be useful to a pub going forward? My best guess is yes, but I don't know for certain. So I would use that process.
Fantastic. Well, we've whizzed through all those questions. There's not any more at the moment. Is there anything you'd like to add, John?
No, except thanks very much, everybody, for listening. It's been fun. If it's, I think these slides are available if people want to contact me. Do I need to put my contact details up on screens? Probably a good idea, isn't it? So I can't seem to be moving my screen forward for some reason. There we go. So there are my contact details, my email address on the right, and underneath it the web address. And I think, Chloe, I think you've got my LinkedIn connection details.
Yeah, so I've just put your LinkedIn profile in the comment section. So if you do have any questions for John after the webinar, or would like to get in touch with him for slides, then you'll be able to through that link. And
do please connect with me on LinkedIn. Just say hi and say you're on the webinar today, and connect with me. And as Chloe says, ask me any questions, ask for a set of the slides, and be happy to help. And nice to meet everybody.
John, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this webinar. If there is anything you'd like to catch up on from today's session, we'll be sending out a replay of the webinar coming shortly to our social media channels. Our next webinar in the Lockdown Learning for Business series takes place on Thursday, the 14th of May at 2 o'clock, and we'll be joined by Linda from R&D Tax Credit, who will advise you on how to claim back up to a third of your costs spent on developing new products, processes, or services. If you haven't already, you can register for this webinar at www.freshbusinessthinking.haysummit.com, or you can click the link in the comments. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you again, John.
Thanks very much, Chloe.
Goodbye, everyone.